Today I want to talk about agnosticism. If you're watching this video, you've likely met an agnostic or are one yourself. And by the way, when I say agnostic, I don't mean someone who's just unsure about theism. I mean an unsureness about any philosophical or theological belief system. Whether it's absurdism or Buddhism or spiritualism or nihilism, being an agnostic just means that you've perhaps heard some of these arguments, maybe even have read a few books, and yet find yourself unconvinced by what they have to say. Unlike the science world, where things are visually self-evidential and predictable, when it comes to the metaphysical or the existential or even the ethical, it isn't clear which philosophy or belief system is the correct one. Sure, we can predict some things based on sociological patterns, but it's not the same as in a lab or with an equation. Ethical, existential, and philosophical truths are much more elusive, especially the more you study them. For instance, if you grew up Christian, there were things that you were just simply taught as real. God exists, Jesus is God, and depending on the type of Christianity, you were taught what all that meant. But then, you probably just went off to college, learned about Jean-Paul Sartre or Marx or Edith Butler, and with the help of your professors and peers, your small town mentality shriveled and you began to see things for what they really are, nuanced and complex. Things were not as black and white as your upbringing led you to believe. And so you put Christianity in a little time capsule and started looking for other more sophisticated theories of origin, purpose, and meaning. Whether it's Nietzsche or Camus or Sartre or Marx, you realize that there is more than one ontological theory and that theism is not at all the obvious default. You perhaps don't quite dismiss Christianity, but after all the counter-arguments, especially the problem of evil, your skepticism of an all-loving God rose to the point where you can't pray to something you don't believe in and be honest with yourself at the same time. But you also can't commit to any other philosophy simply because the likelihood of their truth is just as questionable. But that's okay, because the search for truth is perhaps more interesting and fascinating than the truth itself. Not necessarily because you don't want to find the truth, but because you don't want to park your car in the wrong truth, so to speak. And so the search continues. It goes on from being an investigation to being some form of curiosity enterprise. Not something you stake your life on. You're prudent after all. And I think this is a problem with smart people. Smart people are stuck in some middle ground, something you might not think about often or examine at all. Perhaps you like this middle ground. The middle is the better after all. You can never be wrong if you're in the middle. Unless you're Switzerland, of course. Some say up to 100,000 Jews could have been spared if the Swiss fought the Nazis. Then, of course, some others say that if they allied with them, things could have been much worse. Is this really what we take out of this? Is it really better not to participate than to find yourself in the wrong side of history? What's a hard question? This is the core issue that intelligent, prudent people find themselves in. The arguments for Christianity are very convincing, especially when you bring Christ into the picture. If you've taken them with any seriousness, a carpenter from Nazareth becoming the most influential person ever known in that time period, this type of thing happens exactly once in history. An unprecedented event. Not to mention the Romans who, convinced with Greek rationalism, still chose to believe in the God-man 300 years after his alleged resurrection. But the arguments against them, well, they're no straw man either. If God really wanted a relationship with man, why all the wars? Why all the unbelief? How many non-resistant non-believers are there? And yet God is silent. How can an agnostic then commit to God, even if they want to, without a sincere belief which comes from some form of intellectual convincing? This is the kernel, really, the hard question. What are we after? Are we after truth, or are we after the search for truth? In some ways, they're both kind of the same thing. But if we can't commit to a starting point, are we really better than Switzerland? Is being neutral actually dealing no damage? Surely if you saw someone being mistreated, your neutrality would be damaging. Is it really so different when it comes to the core of your existence? I too fell away from Christianity, saw it as blind faith. I was almost sure that Christianity was just another religion trying to make sense of the senseless. But then I started taking a closer look at Christ. especially in his time, his parables and actions were so countercultural that he ended up being executed, brutally, might I add. Then his followers, scattered like headless chickens, all of them portray a calm, joyful demeanor, saying he rose again. Then volumes upon volumes of early church theology written, reviewed, carefully scrutinized, and 2,000 years later, and he's still worshipped in the altar, not to mention the existential, philosophical soundness of the so-called truth he brought. At what point the risks starts to balance to the tip of the other side of the scale, and you start to realize that Christianity does have some level of soundness. You maybe start reading Aquinas or St. Augustine or the early church fathers, and you start realizing that there is something to Christianity. And so now you're in a weird place where, maybe there is something to Christianity, but this demands everything. This demands that I give everything up, every other pursuit. And in a way it does. Christianity does ask that you give up this search for truth in a way, but not in the way that you might think. The search for truth for Christianity is just the search for a relationship with Christ, which it sounds really weird. And that's probably because we're speaking English right now, and most of the English world is populated with Protestant Christianity, which sees Christ as a buddy. But that's not how early Christians saw Christ. That's not how the church that he establishes sees him. They see him as an authority, as truth itself. And it doesn't have to conflict with other forms of truth, other people that have found this truth. I mean, this is why Aquinas is so influential. This is why, even in just the philosophy world, both like Aquinas and St. Augustine, very influential thinkers. C.S. Lewis is another very influential thinker. But I totally understand, like, smart people want to keep being smart. They like being able to express themselves. They like being able to look at different options. And I think this is kind of like very, very greatly illuminated with characters like Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson refuses to take Christianity seriously. He takes it seriously as a case study, as a psychologist, but he doesn't take it seriously as a reality, which basically dismisses the entire thing. Because Christianity is a claim about reality. It's not a claim about psychology or some kind of like archetypical Jungian thing. It's a claim about truth. And yet Jordan Peterson just doesn't really take it to that level. And I think it's because he is clinging on to his intellect. He's clinging on to his own sovereignty over what he thinks he wants to know, over what he knows. And I totally understand. I mean, before I started reading more church father stuff, I was reading, Albert Camus. I was reading Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, which, he's a Christian, but different kind of Christian. And it's all very fascinating. And as a Christian, I think you can still read all of these things, but then those become the case study. Those become the psychological reads. At the end of the day, you kind of have to commit to something. Well, maybe you don't have to, but from a heart perspective, there comes a point where you kind of should commit to something. Why should we commit to something? Well, because there's times in our lives, especially when we grow older, where life really tests our limits. And if we don't have a strong foundation as to why we do certain things, then life becomes very dark and very foggy, and the right way becomes very obscure. But if Christianity is true and God is right there all along trying to guide you, then you don't run into this problem. You have this trust. Like Kierkegaard says, your despair just kind of goes away. And of course, this is something that's up to everybody. If you're still watching this, you might think, well, I'm not in despair. I don't despair at all. And you might think that that's true, but look within and actually ask yourself if you despair. And if you do, ask yourself why. But anyway, bottom line, smart people don't believe in God, not because God is not for smart people, but because smart people, they, at least from my perspective, they want to preserve their sovereignty over their intellect. And so you'll notice that smart people don't just not believe in God, but they don't believe in much. And this is not an attack, by the way. This is how I used to think. I was just not convinced by many theories. I was not convinced with Nietzsche. I was not convinced with Dostoevsky. I was not convinced with Camus. I wasn't convinced with Marx. There's so many things where people would present pretty good and solid arguments, and I still would be like, well, I don't know if this person is considering, a bunch of other things. I wasn't convinced with Aquinas. I wasn't convinced with Kant. I certainly was not convinced with Peterson. And I lived in this place in which I really didn't believe anything. I didn't really, and from my point of view, I loved not believing in something. I didn't want to be tied to something else. I like to be able to study everything that I could. But it gets to a point where you kind of think to yourself, like, why am I on this why am I in this rabbit hole? Why am I reading all these books? Why am I watching all these videos if I'm not taking any of this seriously? I'm just not. It's fun. It's fun to see how people think. It's fun to see how, like, intellectuals kind of like come up with these with these ideas, and sometimes it's beautiful writing. I mean, sure, Nietzsche had some interesting things to say, but like the way he said them, you have to give it to the guy. Like, he writes just beautifully, and yet one remains unconvinced. One raises his eyebrows and doesn't really give him the credit. So I think that is what's going on. Intelligent people cling to their sovereignty over their intellect. And so an intelligent person tends not to believe in anything, which perhaps is why they can be lonely and they can forget to live. But that doesn't mean that an intelligent person can't be a Christian. And that doesn't mean that Christians are stupid. It perhaps means that Christians might have enough humility to put their intellect underneath a greater truth, which is a difficult thing to do. And it might sound like giving up. And if that's what you're doing, if you're just like shutting down your intellect, if you're just completely shutting out truth and you're just walking into a church, sitting down and then just shutting down your brain, then yes, that is cowardly and that is just giving up. But if it is a constant struggle and a constant eagerness to find out what this all is, what this all means, then I don't think you give up your intellect. I think that it definitely challenges your ego, and it definitely challenges a lot. But at the same time, I think it makes a lot of sense, and it gives you a lot of sense in your life, and you can pursue a different form of intellect. But anyway, this video is getting pretty long, and the retention is probably speaking to one person. So thank you for watching. I might make a Jordan Peterson sort of dedicated thing on why he's not a Christian. It's probably going to get a lot. I don't know if it's going to get any views. But anyway, thank you for watching. This is Logos and Mythos. Thank you for tuning in.